One of my favorite verses is Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. We rarely, if we're honest, know what God's doing because we don't think like God. We're always trying to seek, what is God doing? That's the life of a follower of Jesus. Now, we're going to talk about the story of Ruth today. This is chapter 9 of the story. And Ruth follows the chapter in the Bible of the Judges. But Ruth actually happened at the same time as Judges did. There's 3 observations I want to make before we start in the story of Ruth. First off, Ruth's story takes place during that time. Now, if you remember last week, Randy talked about Judges. And Judges is not like the way we interpret Judges today. The Judges back then were more like tribal leaders. And the book of Judges is more about war and judgment. It was pretty brutal. But now we get to the story of Ruth, and it's more about family. The second observation I want to make is that this story takes primarily place in Bethlehem, with a brief detour to Moab. So the third observation is in this story, God uses famine again to accomplish his purposes. So I want you to watch this video of Randy Frazee kind of explaining the story of Ruth.
This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of their 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, and one was named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. When Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home," but Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
In the lower story, all hope is lost for Naomi. She moved from Bethlehem to Moab with her husband to weather the storm of a famine raging in the land around them at the same time as Gideon's story from the last chapter. Not long after they arrive, her husband dies, but she still has her 2 sons to care for her. While they are in Moab, they both marry Moabite women, and 10 years later, tragically, both of her sons die. In complete emptiness, Naomi decides it's time to go back home to Bethlehem. Her daughter-in-laws decide that they want to go. She begs them not to come, that they will have a better life if they stay in Moab. She finishes her speech with these painful words, "No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." In the lower story, we see that she had lost all hope, and she felt it was all a result of the Lord's doing in the upper story. Naomi was able to convince the one daughter-in-law to stay, but the other, Ruth, insisted that she go. Here's how she put her decision: "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." She has certainly chose the road less traveled. Life will be extremely hard for Naomi and Ruth. They will likely live in poverty the rest of their life. And to make matters worse, Ruth is a Moabite. The Moabites had oppressed the Israelites for 18 years before Ehud the judge delivered them. In the lower story, there was little chance that she would be accepted. Yet out of deep love for her mother-in-law and her well-being, this is the path that she chose. When Naomi and Ruth's sandals crossed into Bethlehem's borders, after being gone for over a decade, the women of the town exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Naomi replied, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." The word Mara in Hebrew obviously means bitter. She is really convinced that God has orchestrated all of this, and He has, but she just doesn't know how the story will end. Now, Naomi owns land that her husband and sons used to farm. However, Naomi can't manage this property by herself, so she'll be forced to sell her land to pay the bills. And once she does, this will basically be committing her life to servitude. But the bigger, bitter pill to swallow is that the identity of a family is tied to land ownership. If her husband's land is lost, it'll be as though he never existed. So how will two poor single ladies make it in Bethlehem? Well, the Old Testament made a provision for the poor called gleaning. Those who owned land would send the harvesters into the field to gather the crop. Whatever little was left, they were to leave for the poor to glean. This is Ruth's primary way to help and to show love to her aging mother-in-law. She will do the gleaning and hopefully bring home enough for both of them to live on. She randomly picks a field to glean, and the owner shows her favor. Ruth is shocked that she is accepted as an outsider and even given protection. Here's what she asked the owner: "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" He replies, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth runs home with her arms filled with food and excitement and shares the story with Naomi over a Thanksgiving meal. Naomi inquires about the identity of the owner, and Ruth tells her that his name is Boaz. Naomi almost has a heart attack. Why? Because Boaz is a close relative. Why is she so excited about that? You see, there is a concept taught in the law, in Deuteronomy 25 to be exact, that states that if a man dies without an heir, the next of kin has the option to marry his widow, love her, take care of her, pay off the financial debts, and redeem the land. This man is called the kinsman redeemer. When they have a child, he is to deed the land to that heir in the name of the deceased husband, thus allowing his name to live on. Essentially, the kinsman redeemer takes on a huge risk and in the end doesn't increase his net worth a single penny. Naomi hasn't been this hopeful in a long time. She takes on the role of a Jewish matchmaker like the one you see in The Fiddler on the Roof. She tells Ruth to take a shower and splash on some Chanel 5 and put on her Sabbath best. She was then to head over to Boaz's house that night, playing the part of Cinderella. She needed to wait until he had finished eating. You never approach a man with an empty stomach. After he went to bed, she was to sneak in and uncover his feet and lie down at the foot of his bed. Boaz would understand exactly what Ruth was doing. It was a nonverbal way of requesting marriage. Ruth does everything Naomi asks of her. And Boaz wakes up startled and asks who she is. She replies, I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Now, the word for garment in Hebrew is the same word for wing. When Ruth first met Boaz, he referred to God's wing providing her refuge. Ruth was now asking Boaz to be God's wing to her, and he accepted. He exercised his obligation, and they were married. He not only bought Ruth's widow's land, but all his brother's land and their father's as well. Risking his own estate, didn't add to his personal treasury by one line item, and redeemed them all. What drives a Boaz to turn his attention from his own selfish needs and wants to reach out to an outsider? Well, as it turns out, Boaz, the now strong, wealthy, respected man in Bethlehem, knew what it was like to be an outsider. We learn in another part of the story of the Bible that Boaz's mother is Rahab, the harlot. Rahab was the Canaanite prostitute that provided coverage for Joshua's spies when they were scoping out the land. She risked her life and as a result was adopted into the family of Israel. Boaz knew what it felt like to be an outsider at one time and had it in his heart to reach out to someone else in that same position. As it turns out, that person was Ruth. Ruth and Boaz had a little boy together. That little lad didn't know it yet, but he will inherit the land of his father, Mahlon, whom he never met. He will carry on that family name because of the kind act of Boaz. The women of the town said to Naomi, Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. In the lower story, Naomi thought her life was over, that God had given up on her. Well, she was mistaken. Naomi took her grandson and cuddles him in her lap. The women of the town spread the gossip. Naomi has a son. What happened to the name Mara? Bitter. I guess it didn't stick. She went back to being called Naomi, which in Hebrew means beautiful. And beautiful her life became. She now had a son to work the land, which meant that the name of her husband, Elimelech, would live on. The little heir's name was Obed, which simply means worker. Sounds like a boring name until you understand the whole story. As overwhelming a turnaround as this is, the good news doesn't stop here. There's more going on in the upper story. At the end of the book of Ruth, we are given the genealogy of Boaz's family. It is here that Obed grows up and has a son named Jesse. Jesse then grows up and has a son named David. And 28 generations later, a little baby is born in a manger in the town of Bethlehem named Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate kinsman redeemer, and he came from the family of an outsider named Ruth. God was not only working above the scene of Ruth's life to provide her earthly needs in the lower story, he was working out his upper story plan with her in mind. He went out of his way to include an outsider, a pagan Moabite in the lineage of Jesus. Now that is extreme acceptance. In the lower story, their life seemed hopeless, with no chance of acceptance. In the upper story, God redeems their lives and accepts them as his own. You know, right now, your story might seem a little hopeless and bitter to the taste. But remember, if you love God and align your life to his purposes, as we learn in Romans 8:28, God is working it all out for the good. So wait patiently for God. Wait patiently for God to unfold his good plan for you.
That was better said than I could have said it. Randy would have said it just like that, right? So can you guys imagine how Naomi felt? I mean, she moves to a foreign land to try to help her family, and her husband dies right away. Then her two sons marry foreign women, and then they die 10 years later. So she's left destitute with trying to take care of two other widows. That's crazy to think about. It had to be one of the most difficult times of her life. I don't know how many of you have ever felt this sense that God is moving his favor away from you. If you've lived for more than 30 years, you probably have had an experience like that. It's bizarre. At least it feels like that in the lower story. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about the times in my life where it's felt like I've been abandoned by God. Where did he go? What happened? And I'm going to share a couple stories today about an understanding of the lower story versus the upper story. What I think is going on, but what was really going on. Now, I don't know how many of you have grown up in the Midwest. I know a few of you have because I know you. There is this mentality for people that are born in the Midwest, they believe you're going to work there and you're going to stay there and you're going to die there. People in the Midwest don't have this mentality of moving away from the Midwest. It's strange. It's just a weird. Most of them don't know they all have seasonal affect disorder until they come to Florida or Colorado or something. The sun comes out in the winter. It's like shocking. So when I got out of the Navy, I moved back to Cincinnati because I was from the Midwest and I thought that's where I was supposed to go back, And I started going to school to become a therapist. It was pretty cool because I was able to cram my 4 years bachelor's psychology degree into 7 years. Then I went on to get my master's in counseling, and I was working as a clinical director at a 50-bed inpatient facility. I had about 8 therapists that were working for me, and I was overseeing the treatment of all these men who were dealing with alcoholism and cocaine addiction and domestic violence. I was having a blast. This was really cutting-edge treatment stuff we were doing. Then our pastor found out I was a therapist. So one Sunday, he pulled me aside and asked me if I'd be open to leading a recovery group. And I thought, well, that sounds like a good way to serve. So we launched a 30-week group to help people deal with the issue of codependency. The first night of group, 85 people showed up for our small group. I was a little overwhelmed. It's like, okay, this is not a small group. So I sat everyone in a circle because that's what therapists do. It was one of those big rooms that had 2 dividers in it. And we opened both dividers and we just sat in this big circle. I remember the first night, all we got to talk about is what the group was about. We got their names and why they were there. I thought for sure that the size of the group would weed some people out. Well, the second week rolled around and 93 people showed up for small group. So I sat them in a circle again and started to try to facilitate small group. I had no idea what I was doing. By week 3, I had split them into 12 smaller groups, and I spent the next 28 weeks just going from group to group, making sure nobody was hurting anybody. But we instantly had small groups for alcoholism and drug addiction and anger issues, sexual abuse recovery and infertility and boundaries and eating disorders and bipolar disorder. We even had a small group for people with head injury trauma. It was amazing, just the momentum that was going on there. So within a couple of years, I was overseeing basically 50 groups on any given week, and I still had no idea what I was doing. In the meantime, I was still the clinical director at this treatment facility, and I had 3 young kids at home. So I remember when I felt like I needed to step away from my role at the church because I had my other real job, I called it, and 2 young kids at home. The church had doubled in size during that 2-year period from 1,000 to 2,000. But I went up to the lead pastor and I said, hey, this has been a blast. I've had just an incredible time watching God heal people and being a part of something so encouraging and just life-giving. But I need to step away because I have a real job and 2 young kids at home. Well, he freaked out. He said, there is no way you're supposed to do that. You are supposed to be a pastor at this church. And I'm like, I'm not a pastor. the thought of that just sounded weird to me. Side note, I've been doing this for over 30 years now. The thought of that still sounds weird to me, just to be honest. I had no theological training. I was trained as a therapist. But he told me to pray about it, so I did. After a week of wrestling with God, I decided to take the leap and jump into full-time ministry. So within the next few years, the church doubled in size again, up to 4,000. And the Cincinnati, if you don't know, is the same size as Denver. There were hospitals referring people to Monday Night Recovery Group on discharge to come to our groups at a church. There were judges ordering people to come to Monday Night Recovery as part of their probation. The thing was just nuts. It was weird. So pretty soon, I was on the leadership team of the church, and I was overseeing 32 of the 100 employees of the church. There's a picture of our pastoral team here. But I was responsible for recovery ministry, men's ministry, women's ministry, youth ministry, singles ministry, children's ministry, and prayer ministry. People were coming to us from all over the country to figure out how we had become one of the fastest growing, that was me in my Amish phase, right there in front. People were coming from all over the country to figure out how we'd become one of the fastest growing churches in the country. I still had no idea what I was doing, just for the record. All I knew was that God was growing our church. He was healing people. He was leading people into an authentic relationship with Him in spite of us, not because of us. People were just asking us, how'd you do this? It's like, we didn't do anything. We don't know what's going on. Now, keep in mind, pastoring is unlike any other occupation I know. First off, there's no separation between your personal life and your professional life. Second of all, what other job do you work with your close friends, where you pray together, where you live life deeply together with your coworkers, where you marry your daughter at work, where you bury your friends? What kind of job is like that? Our leadership team became very, very close. We would celebrate birthdays and anniversaries and holidays together. We would celebrate victories together. There were 7 of us on this team. This is the leadership team at the church. You probably can't tell which one I am. But we played together. We worked hard together. Peggy and I were knit into this amazing family of God. It was one of the most incredible experiences of our lives. The thought of ever leaving would never cross our minds. So one day I was having my regular supervisory meeting with our prayer pastor, and he came in, he brought his guitar, and he asked if he could sing me a song he wrote for me. And I thought that sounded strange, but I'd heard stranger because I was the pastor of recovery, so I said, sure. He started singing about how God wanted me to know how much He loved me, but He was about to break me. Then Rusty he broke down and started weeping uncontrollably in our meeting. It took him about 15 minutes to get his composure enough to leave. I had no idea what was happening. I wasn't sure what to make of that. Now, soon after that, we had hired a consultant to meet with us to talk about restructuring our fast-growing church. At one of the meetings, he asked the leadership team, who's the most influential leader in the church? And all my colleagues pointed to me. I was shocked. I was like, I'm not the lead pastor. I'm not the worship pastor. I was probably the least visible pastor on the staff at the time. I couldn't understand how that could be, but then I realized that I'm overseeing all the people ministries. Anything that affects people is what I was responsible for in the church. That's why they said that. In typical consultant language, he said, I appeared to have too much responsibility, which led to a discussion of splitting my responsibilities up into smaller parts. That led to a discussion with the leadership team of them believing that I wouldn't be challenged by doing just a part of my role anymore. After a couple of months of closed-door meetings, my job as a pastor at that church was over. I felt like I had lost my job for doing a good job. I'd never lost a job before. I couldn't help but feeling like I'd done something wrong. So, in an attempt to understand what was happening, Peggy and I would go to the leadership team, our close friends, and say, what's really going on? And they would say, we don't know. And for some reason, we believed them. But we were still hurt and angry. I remember sobbing so uncontrollably at a meeting I had at a restaurant that I was embarrassed. I could not gain my composure. Now, for those of you who know me as the stoic German that I am, that's saying something. It felt as though we were being ripped from the fabric of our family. It felt as though God's favor had turned from us. Peggy and I felt rejected by our closest friends. It was bizarre. Now, in the meantime, my younger sister, Monica, was at the end of her 2-year battle with cancer. And Monica was one of my closest friends all my life. We were two peas in a pod. She was only 38 years old. We had walked with her through chemo and radiation and bone marrow transplants. We'd built an apartment in our basement to take care of her at the end. During the last few months of her life, it was an incredible joy to see her come into relationship, authentic relationship, with the Jesus that I knew. But it was torture seeing her wither away to skin and bones. Now, as things started to fall apart in Cincinnati, I wrote a friend of mine who I'd met several years earlier, in Germany, of course. Rick was the lead pastor here at the Vineyard in Fort Collins. He was also an area leader for Vineyards. So I asked him if he knew of any churches that were looking for an executive pastor. Rick had tried for 4 years to get his church to grow past 1,000. He'd just come out of a board meeting where they had told him, you need to hire somebody that has been where we want to go, that understands what we need to do. He sat down at his desk in frustration, and he said he was just banging his head on his desk. And then when he sat up, there was my letter. What I didn't know is that a few years earlier, he had come to Cincinnati to try to covertly recruit Peggy and I to come out to Fort Collins to help him with the church. So after he read my letter, he called me and left a frantic message on my voicemail asking me if I'd call him right away to see if he could join his team. You guys remember answering machines? That was a long time ago. A month later, my sister passed away. And a couple of weeks later, we loaded everything we had up and moved out here to Fort Collins. That was in 1999. We knew within a month of being here that this is where God wanted us to be. It was his plan all along. I spent the next 20 years serving Rick and his team and watching God do incredible things in us and through us. And just to be honest, most of the time, we had no idea what we were doing. But the church grew again. One thing I do know, we never would have left Cincinnati if God didn't force us to go. That was the upper story. It wasn't what we perceived. Our lower story looked like we were being rejected, cast aside. But God had another assignment for us here in Fort Collins. How would he get us to leave if we don't have that mentality? Now, it still took us years to forgive our friends, but through repeated prayer and God's mercy, we were able to let it go. A couple of months ago, one of my good friends in Cincinnati had a gathering with most of the old leadership team from 30 years ago. Most of the team had left as hurt as we had because it had become part of that culture. But this reunion was a time of healing. We spent a better part of 3 days together sharing God's stories. On the last night we were there, this is the team just a couple of months ago. On the last night, my good friend, before he prayed, he said, we got to experience a move of God that very few will ever experience. A lot of people came to know Jesus and grew in their faith, but we didn't know what we were doing most of the time. And we ended up hurting each other. And now we need to forgive each other. And we did. It was such a healing time for us. All right. I'm going to tell you one more quick story about what we see happening and what God's doing. A few years ago, I was helping build a prayer loft at our church in the kids area. Now, I've been on a ladder many times because I used to do remodeling when I was in college, so I was pretty comfortable on a ladder. But I guess I leaned over a little too far, and the ladder went that way, and I went that way, and I fell 10 feet to the concrete pavement. I remember as I was falling, I was thinking, oh, this won't be so bad. Well, I was wrong. After 20 minutes of laying there and feeling like I just could not breathe, I knew something was wrong. So my friends loaded me into the passenger side of my car and took me to the hospital. When we got there, I could not get out of the car. It took 3 people to help just pry me out of the car because I couldn't move. After a few x-rays, I found out that I had broken 3 ribs and 2 vertebrae. I was laid up for weeks. But that's not the end of the story. A couple of months later, I went in for my annual physical, and all my lab work came back totally off. Something was definitely wrong. So my doctor was concerned, and he sent me to a specialist. The specialist looked at my x-rays from when they had looked at my broken vertebrae, and he saw a growth on my pancreas on those x-rays. So they did a biopsy, and they found out it was a precancerous cyst, but it was huge, and they needed to take it out. So that led to a Whipple surgery and 3 months in the hospital. But the doctors are convinced that me falling off the ladder saved my life. Now, my friends like to say God pushed me off the ladder, but that's their sense of humor. So, you know, one of the most profound verses in Scripture that Peggy and I always turn to is Jeremiah 29:11. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you future and a hope." You know, when we're hurting or offended by what others have done to us, or we can't make sense of the trauma we're going through, it's really hard to see how God's leading us. The danger is to become bitter, like Naomi was becoming. But God had a plan. He was going to rescue the world through a foreigner, through an outsider. Ruth became the first recorded descendant of the ultimate kinsman redeemer. They had no idea what God was doing there, what that was leading to. Now, as we move into response time today, I want you to know that we believe that God is active in our lives and he speaks to us. He could be speaking to you through worship. He could be speaking to you just by giving you an impression, maybe a discussion with someone today, or maybe through something I said today. But we do believe God is active in our lives. When you think about some of the most painful experiences in your life, have you chosen bitterness to deal with them? Are you open to God giving you a different perspective? The upper story perspective? His perspective? Maybe you're in the middle of one of those experiences right now. If you are, I want to encourage you to meet with the prayer team in the back. They're wearing lanyards, and they'll pray for you and help you just come to grips with what's going on in your life. Maybe there's a wound from years ago that just seems to keep coming up and fester. You know, that's not unusual. If there is, I want to encourage you to go to the cross over here and to write whatever that thing is on a sticky note and leave it on the cross as a symbolic gesture of giving it back to God. Let's pray. We head into response time. Lord, I thank you that you do have good plans for us, for hope and a good future. And Lord, we apologize for sometimes we can't see it. We can't see what you're doing. But I just ask that you give us your eyes today, Lord. Help us see through your eyes. Help us see the upper story. And Lord, if there are hurts that people are struggling with today, I ask you that you just give them your comfort. Lord, help them begin to heal or continue to heal. Lord, we want to be your people. And even though we don't normally know what you're doing or what we're doing, we ask that you give us your eyes to see. Help us see with your eyes. In your name, amen.